Have you ever heard of imaginary friends? Those invisible companions that children create to provide themselves with artificial friendships. It's funny to think about how real they seem to a child when everyone knows they are just a figment of their imagination. It's almost as if they are real. But after a while, that friend fades away and you never hear from them again, usually because the child has lost interest or just grown up. But even something so childlike and friendly can have a dark side. You just never see it. When I was in fourth grade, I didn't have many friends. In fact, I didn't have any friends at all. Everyone just didn't like me. I tried to make friends, but they just turned me down for some reason. Every day, I would eat my lunches alone, and at recess, I would sit by the tree and watch everyone having fun. I remember how badly I wanted it, to the point where it was unbearable. After many failed attempts at making friendships, I realized that it would be easier to make my own friend. The plan was completely safe, because this friend couldn't say no. I was a very creative kid at the time, so I had no trouble creating an imaginary friend. Her name was Susan. She looked to be about my age, had straight blonde hair, and freckles on her cheekbones and nose. She was so friendly, well, at least to me, because no one else knew her. I spent every second of the day with her. She would sit with me at lunch, and we would make up silly jokes about school and talk about how heavy my teacher was. At recess, we play tag. I don't think anyone noticed me talking to myself or running around the field alone. She even came home with me. Susan and I were best friends for the rest of elementary school. By the time I moved on to middle school, I started paying attention to reality and noticed how childish my imaginary friends seemed. Eventually, I stopped talking to Susan and went on with my normal day. But Susan never left. Every now and then, I would see her in the back of the room or walking behind me down the hallway. Every time I looked at her, she was smiling, as if she was pleased to be around me. Another thing I noticed was that she was aging along with me. Susan wasn't staying 9 years old like she was when she started her life. She was growing up like I was. I came to the conclusion that I couldn't get rid of Susan because she was no longer an imaginary friend. She was a figure who silently followed me and whom I had absolutely no control over. I didn't mind because, at the time, she wasn't interfering with anything. She managed to stay with me when I moved on to middle school. By then, I had made some wonderful friends for whom Susan had an unbounded hatred. I heard her ridicule them and react negatively to everything they said. She didn't like me being friends with anyone but her. But she didn't hate me for it. She didn't even hate me for ignoring her for the past few years and continued to treat me like I was her best friend, which apparently I was. Susan was becoming more and more sinister and vile. She seemed to hate everything but me, and that had its consequences. I remember one day I asked my mom a question while she was on the phone. She was cooking something on the stove and had her back to me, and I was sitting on the kitchen island right behind her. I called her name about 3 times before Susan hit her. I remember the shock I felt at that moment. How could Susan hit her? All this time, I thought I had somehow gone crazy and couldn't shake off the childhood memories, but Susan seemed to have taken on her own physical traits. Mom turned to me, a little angry, and asked why I hit her. I couldn't say it was Susan. I was 14 years old, and she would have thought I was crazy. So I just told her I was sorry, but I forgot what I was going to ask. I was still shaken by what had just happened. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I didn't know if Susan was a real being or not. She had a mind of her own and could physically interact with everything, but no one could see her. Maybe they were just ignoring the real person. No, that's impossible. I created her. She didn't exist until 4th grade. Shortly after that, things began to deteriorate. She started tripping and pushing people she didn't like. She even hit a few of my friends for making friendly insults toward me. I began to be wary of her and had some anxiety when socializing with friends. This continued until I moved on to my sophomore year of college. One night, I was hanging out with my friend Morgan at her apartment. I was there because we were working on a project together, but had waited until the last minute to finish it, so we needed to complete it within the next 2 days. The night was fun. Susan was nowhere to be seen, so I didn't feel as anxious as I usually did. Considering that Morgan was my best friend, the one I trusted the most, I decided to tell her about Susan. I felt awkward telling her because I had never told anyone before. Plus, she had a skeptical look on her face as I spoke. "What are you? Are you crazy or something?" She giggled. I was starting to feel a little uneasy. "I'm not crazy. She's real. This all really happened. You have to believe me," I pleaded. "Look, whatever you're saying, I don't want to get into it. There's no way an imaginary friend came to life. This isn't an R.L. Stine book. You need to get a grip," she said. I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. My best friend didn't believe me, even though I knew everything I was saying was true. Shortly after that, I left. Susan was still nowhere to be found, and I began to think that maybe I really had lost my mind. The next morning, I was awakened by 3 heavy knocks on the door. I wiped my eyes and went to open it. When I opened it, I could see 2 policemen through my foggy vision. They told me they were taking me in for questioning and led me to the back of the police car. I had no idea what I was being questioned for, so I assumed it was just theft or something. I was dead wrong. I was told that Morgan was murdered last night. Allegedly, her roommate found her lifeless corpse when he came home late that night. According to several witnesses, I was the only one who had been with her before that. I tried to tell them how I left and that I couldn't have been the murderer, considering she was my best friend. They pointed out that the only trace of another person was me, so it couldn't have been anyone else. I knew, deep down I knew, it was Susan. After that, I was imprisoned for life. I saw Susan for the first time in a long time and realized I couldn't ignore her anymore. "Who are you?" I asked. She giggled, and a wide grin appeared on her face. "I am you," she replied. I never spoke to her again after that, but she still stayed by my side, even in prison. Every day, I tried to convince the guards that it was Susan, but they waved me off. Soon, they started giving me medication to deal with my insanity. I know I'm not crazy. Susan exists, and she killed Morgan. It wasn't me. You have to believe me. It was Susan. She's real. She's not an imaginary friend. She's real. She's real. I know she is. She has to be. You believe me, don't you? Don't you? I've told you everything, so you have to believe me. I have to get out of here. I can't do this anymore. I don't know how I'm gonna escape. I might have to eliminate some guards. I can't, but Susan can.